So I've been trying to make a video on bullets and wounding mechanisms and cartridges, and I'm having a difficult time putting it all in one video. But we're moving. I'm not going to be able to do this for a while, so I'm just going to try and do it all in one shot here. So what we're looking at is a typical 6.5 Creedmoor cartridge, and um, it's a good and a bad thing. Gotten a lot of people into shooting, hunting, all that kind of stuff, light recoiling, good ballistics, all that. It's not by any means the optimal short action cartridge for what most people want to do. What most people do with the Creedmoor is try and go and shoot as long range as possible and try and take animals because they believed all the marketing hype about external ballistics, and they don't understand about terminal ballistics. So if you go, okay, smart guy, if you wanted to do an optimal short action cartridge, what would it be? And it would be, a 7 millimeter. So we still have good ballistic coefficient bullets and options there, but we would be able to go to a 160 grain weight bullet because a small bore wounding mechanism requires 2,400 foot per second impact velocities. And at 160 grain, we can get 2,000 foot-pounds of impact energy. And everybody can argue, except when you look at real research done by guys who've actually shot animals, Randy Newberg, for instance, talks about 7 millimeter weight being sufficient for, say, elk at reasonable distances. You read ballistic studies, and he talks about the impact velocities on small bores being, somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,400 foot per second or higher, et cetera, et cetera. So there's plenty of research done on this stuff. Just nobody seems to be understanding much about that when they're looking at say the Creedmoor, because all they seem to care about is ballistics and drop, and all these things applies to target stuff. But when you're talking about bullets, all the animal knows is what bullet hit it at what velocity. So when we look at these bullets, for instance, I've got a selection of a couple different types of bullets here, and these are typically kind of constructed hunting bullets because I'm kind of a practical rifle guy. I'm a lot more about that than I am the, say, scout or long range or whatever. And if you want a long range, look at the ballistics on the 7 millimeter 08, not even the improved one. This is a Creedmoor improved. So we should get, we don't need to go into the details of it, but even the standard 7 millimeter 08 is going to give you north of 2,800 foot per second on a max load with a 160 grain weight bullet at a 0.6 BC. So if that doesn't beat a Creedmoor, I guess you're doing different math than I am. Anyway, this is a 150 grain 308 soft point bullet, and so this was sufficient, especially in a 308 type cartridge, for a long time for many applications. And this is the /6, which originally that's what it started out as, was 2,700 foot a second with a 150 grain bullet. And it was just the American version of the 757 Mauser. We'll there's other videos on that. We can talk about that. But the reason why I want to talk about this is because when we do the math on the 2,400 foot per second medium or small bore wounding mechanism and minimum impact velocity, what we see is, if we're plus or minus 5 or 10 grain, it's probably not the end of the world. And again, if you lack it in mass, maybe you make it up in velocity, right? And if you have smaller animals that don't require big, heavier bullets like a 270 grain and 375, because, they're not, Africa didn't lose its megafauna at the end of the last ice age in the Younger Dryas the way that we did. So these small bores tend to be what we use in North America. And so what we've got here is a selection of bullets that kind of represents what people use and make sense of in North America's big game. So there is some 375 stuff, especially in Alaska, the H&H. And we'll talk about this one and the wounding mechanism because it really applies for 35, 36, and 37. And there's guys using 9.362s and 35 Waylands and stuff up there too. And that tends to be, that's really the medium bores. Some people think of 338s as being a medium bore. In terms of its wounding mechanism, if you read that Nathan Foster guy's research, and specifically about the 35 Wayland, it'll make the most sense. the medium bore wounding mechanism occurs at a lower minimum velocity, about 2,200 foot per second, whereas for the small bore 338s and smaller is 2,400 foot per second. Ignore the 348 for now because it's not really there. And when you do the math on these energy levels at these velocities, what you see, say a 9.3 by 62's typical loadings, not 100 or 286 grain, 270 is real common, and a 375. And if you jack that velocity up to say 225 or 2,400 foot per second with a 225 grain projectile, say a 338 Win Mag or whatever, you see we're real close to that same 3,000 foot-pound impact energy. And so when we look at the old .6, that kind of seems to be the default for big game hunting, because the whole world seems to end at 30 cal in the U.S. And then, if you want to go bigger, you go to like a 220 grain bullet. Well, we talked about why that is, right? At higher velocities, you're going to get similar impact energies. But again, there is some significant difference. And when I look at all this stuff, what I'm trying to figure out is if I'm a practical rifle guy, which I am, and we talked about how you could optimize a short action cartridge, say in a 7mm. But right now we're in this weird world, so it's COVID and all this stuff. I talked a little bit about in a previous video a 280 Ackley, which is a pretty cool cartridge, but I kind of think of it like a 6.5 Creedmoor. It's good, but there's things we can do to improve it. So it's got the reduced taper and sharper shoulder angle we want, but it's still got this very long neck, and this is pushed forward even from a 0.6 neck, but it this was built in a different time, and it's an improved version of a standard cartridge. This is a SAMI spec. I wouldn't change it. This overall length actually exceeds the SAMI spec, but I've got a typical 280 Ackley chamber, not a long throat, so I can't even actually make full use of, say, a 3.5 inch mag length, which is what's typical for most guys in these things. So I've been fooling around, wildcatting. Don't do that; it's unwise. And what I am looking at is 280 is not real common, but a 270 is. And so when I look at a 270, I go, well, wait a minute, why don't you just use this again with the bullet weights, 150 in a 270 or in a 308 is real common. Even in a 7mm, a lot of guys won't go to a 2 or 160. They'll stick with a 150. And again, if you make it up in velocity, you're real close. 50 foot a second faster gets you right at 2,000. And as long as you understand bullet construction and use a properly constructed bullet, you're in good shape. And to be honest, I think you have more problem with, say, a 150 in a 300 Win Mag that's going to blow up at shorter ranges. But looking at this, I'm going, instead of going to a 27 nozzle or a 6.8 Western, why don't we just do an improved version of a 270? My typical 280 Ackley die and a usual GP Lee sizer die will neck my neck down enough to get bullet tension on it. The big problem is these bullets don't sit down far enough in the neck. I'm not going to develop donuts, so we need to walk this forward. But the same way I use my Creedmoor die to resize the either a 7mm for this optimized 7mm short action versus I even do this in a 260. I call it a 260 Creedmoor improved. So I'm using, it's basically an 1/8 of an inch longer. Well, when we look at these guys, if I do that same thing, the problem is we're gonna not be able to headspace off the neck shoulder junction like an Ackley. We have to headspace off the end of the case for a fire form from the parent case. And that's not that big of a deal. I grind custom reamers and stuff. So I did this one a while back in my, it was a 338 .6 Ackley improved reamer, and I just turned the neck down. And this is a standard 280 Ackley shoulder location, and this is what I would change if I was going to make a series of cartridges as Wildcats. And the main reason I do this is because I want a bigger cartridge for a practical rifle, and I don't necessarily want to change the wounding mechanism from a small bore to a large bore, because in North America we don't tend to need it. We talked about that, and then also we tend to object to the recoil of the heavier cartridges. So when I'm looking at this, I think this would be a cool cartridge, which would be a setting this neck for, or this, yeah, the shoulder forward, say an eighth of an inch or 3/16 or whatever, like we do in the others, and just head spacing off the end of the case for a fire form. And so when we start talking about that, well, what brass are you going to use? You're going to use 06 brass. And see, this is the issue when you start looking at the 06, is you realize how far back that neck shoulder junction has been pushed. And that's because the old cartridge designs had these very, very long necks. So when we look at what you would do is like an all-rounder, the 30 cals, the 06 is already playing that role, but the question is, can we optimize it? Can we improve it? And essentially what I'm talking about doing is no different than a 30 Gibbs, which is kind of the most you can get out of a standard rifle cartridge. The difference being, if we can set the bullet out of the case and get more case capacity and not develop bullet donuts, we can get more performance all round. And there's no reason not to do that if we can make use of it in the mag length. And most of the platforms you can run about 3.5 or a little longer. So no reason to not do that. And that, a straight neck up of a 280 Ackley to a 30 cal looks like that. So hopefully you can kind of see that. And you see the neck shoulder junction's been pushed forward. Let me try and get a pointer in here. And you see on an Ackley Improved, that's where you headspace. You headspace on that neck shoulder junction. And because this is a 280 parent case, and the 280, they pushed it forward a little bit, it's pushed forward a bit as well, but we still have too long of a neck. So ideally we want to move that forward even more so. And then, if you have this brass or you want to neck something up, or like I said, fire forming is not a problem. The only problem is rechambering an existing rifle. Say we didn't have brass and you wanted to fire form, like say a 270 or an 06, right? If we go to this new cartridge set, like we talked about, I call it the Rifleman, right? Because it's basically a neck down version of an improved, modernized version of a 35 Whelen. Anybody that knows anything about the Whelen, it was a big game cartridge derived of the 30-06, and it's a great cartridge. It's just it's not that common. 35 bullets aren't that common. We probably wouldn't switch the wounding mechanism today because with the additional bullet weights we don't need to, say in 30 cal and 338s, which weren't even around at the time of the Whelen. The 35 Whelen. The 37 Whelen was kind of the predecessor, and that's basically what this is. It's a straight 06 neck up to a 37, and that was, and I got the bullet hanging way out there because I'm testing some things, but this was sort of where the 35 Whelen started, and then the bullet availability changed, and they went to a 35, and it was designed for big game. It was bigger than the 06, and at the time they didn't have 220 and 225 grain common hunting bullets. It was usually 150s, and maybe they did because that's the 03s really started. The 3003, which was the predecessor to the 06, that's how it started, was a 220. So maybe it just wasn't sufficient for their purposes, and part of that may have been bullet technology at the time too. When we look at this, we're trying to figure out, what would you do with it? And so for me, I really want to do a 33, pushing this neck forward even further, and being able to run the bullet out of the case so I can make use of the full 3.5. Same thing with the 270. And if we want to do a 30 cal version as well, we would push all these necks forward so that we would have optimize the case as much as possible, been able to run the bullet out in the mag well as far as possible, and been able to take advantage of the whole of the platform, because that's what drives most of this stuff is platform. If you look at AR-15 stuff, for instance, it's all driven by the platform development, the mag length, etc. So when we look at this, I'm going, there's plenty of room we can optimize and do some cool Wildcats for different applications, and one of those being like bear defense type cartridge, like in a 37. And this has all been kind of done before, but the design decisions were made, if you look at cartridges like the 376 Steyr, 9.3 by 62, those cartridges are basically ballistic twins of the consistent, 37 and 36, 30-06 case stuff. It's just a matter of how do you fire for them, how do you make brass, all that stuff. So the idea on all these things, the ones that aren't there, 338-06 was kind of there for a while, and it was just a straight neck up. And when you look at that, it's actually a pretty compelling cartridge in terms of its ballistics performance. Like 27-30-ish out of a test barrel with a 225 grain bullet, which is really only about 100 foot per second slower than a 338 Win Mag, which most people do not argue is a big game cartridge. The problem is it's got more recoil than most people like, and so even does the 300 Win Mag. And again, when we're trying to avoid bullet blow up with these soft cup and core, typically available cheap constructed bullets, it makes more sense to go to a cartridge like this, and that's how they wound up with the .6 in the first place, because it was the most recoil a typical guy could take. So, it works real well when we neck it up to a straight 35, and people shouldn't argue about the Whelen if they know anything. So why would we go all the way to a 37? And the answer is because we don't have that many 35 bullets available. It's hard to believe when we look at these bullets, if it's a 375 and a 225 and a 338 at the respective energy levels or impact velocities, say 2,400 foot per second there, and 2,200 foot per second for the medium bores, 35, 36, 37 being medium bores. The energy levels are real similar, and Ron Spomer just did a video about that. The difference is, of course, you're going to get more penetration, so big, heavy animal, that's what you want. But for North American game, we kind of proved out that we don't have to have that if we have these other things going on. So, what would we do as wildcatters? And I think there's plenty of room for a 270 cartridge. The problem is we would need brass already. You'd have to fire form it someplace else or neck it down from .6 or whatever, because of the fact that the neck length is clearanced on the end of the case. So you couldn't easily fire form it from an existing chamber unless you neck down, for instance, .6. You couldn't take the reamer and run it down an existing 270 chamber and have it all work out unless you already had brass fire formed. And guys are kind of familiar with that on the Wildcat side, where you're necking up to produce a false shoulder and then necking down. This one doesn't have a false shoulder. I just ran it into my 280 Ackley die, and I put a spacer at the bottom, because that's how I do these. Like when I'm doing the short action stuff, the difference between this one, the 260 Creedmoor Improved, is the same as the 7mm, and really I did a video on the 270-08 Ackley Improved, and I do the same thing with it, essentially, where you keep it out of the die about an eighth of an inch. Well, how do you set that? Well, what's available that's cheap and common, that's actually precision enough you can use it for headspace like that, and you just use a drill bit. You just take an eighth of an inch drill bit and put it between the top of the shell plate and the bottom of the die, and that's how you do it. And so it's an eighth of an inch for those, but for these we can even go as much as 3/16, even over the 280 Ackley. And we might simplify it and go to an eighth depending upon what we do. But what I'm trying to get to is when you wildcat, the whole thing is what dies do you use and how do you form your brass and do all that. So it's not difficult, but it is a challenge you have to overcome. So if it's easy and it's already thought out for you, it makes it a lot easier. And if we look at things like 300 Blackout and some of these kind of successful wildcats where you could manufacture the brass easily, you can see why they were successful. So probably the 338 would be, you know, I like it just because I like 338 bullets, but you're probably going to wind up with an improved 30 cal that's going to be more popular than it. But the real one that's probably in demand, you know, I don't know about the 27s. There's all these cartridges coming out, 27 Nosler and 6.8 Western and all that stuff. And to me, you know, a 270 is pretty good, and if we could improve it at all, it would be real good. The old .6 is pretty great, but you know, we can do some improvements to it along the lines of what we talked about that hopefully would be worthwhile. And the whole thing we're trying to do is basically improve performance and avoid magnum recoil. And if you read that Nathan Foster at Ballistic Studies, his website about running hard bullet, soft bullet, you can make sense of, you know, especially in a non-magnum like a .6 improved or something, that we would be able to avoid any kind of a bullet blow-up situation and accomplish what we're after. And the one I really see the need for is like a bare defense that would be cheap and available. You know, the 338 would be real cool, and even the 30 cal, if you wanted to both hunt and be able to have sufficient, say, bear protection type. But, you know, if you want just a cheap and available bear protection, like a, you know, you're going to screw a barrel onto a Savage Axis and put a $30 red dot on it and have a sufficient bear protection. There's no reason, when you read about, like, say, the 376 Steyr 9.3 by 62, that's essentially where you'd be with just a 375 06, even without the improvements. So hopefully that makes sense, and I encourage you guys to go read ballisticstudies.com and do look at as much stuff for Nathan Foster as you can find. He's got a YouTube channel. If you look up either of those, Ballistic Studies or Nathan Foster, will come up. And then the other thing that I see that I'd like guys to understand is look at Gunworks did a series of videos on like finding your lands, like when we're talking about all this stuff about setting the bullet out and doing all this and that. You know, it's, you know, where your land's at, how much clearance do you have, all these kinds of things. And then pressures, you know, when you're working up loads or doing hand loading, where do you find pressure, all that. So that Gunworks series of videos on finding your lands and finding max pressure are really good and the best ones I've seen. So hopefully that makes sense, and you guys will find that helpful, and we'll fill you in after components and all that stuff become available more. I've been doing more machining and fiddling and wildcatting than shooting, as you can imagine, like a lot of people. So I've got barrels and different cartridges, guns. I might do some practical rifle stuff. And if you guys have questions or comments, let me know. I appreciate it. Thanks.